The midday sun shone down on the small suburban branch of the London National Bank, a modern-looking structure with sleek glass windows and pristine marble floors. It appeared to be a typical day in the life of a well-to-do financial institution. The hustle and bustle of business transactions carried on inside, with customers browsing through accounts and bankers diligently typing away at their terminals. But outside, the world was anything but typical. A man dressed in worn clothes shuffled toward the entrance of the bank. His jacket was frayed at the sleeves, his boots were scuffed, and his hat pulled low over his face. The man's gait was slow, deliberate, almost as though he carried an invisible weight with every step. He walked up to the security door and paused. For a moment, he simply stood there, looking at the polished doors and the gleaming interior. There was a visible hesitation, a deep breath, as if gathering the strength to enter. But then, with an air of quiet determination, the man stepped forward and entered the building. Inside, the sterile, polished world of the bank seemed to ignore him. The employees, suited and well-groomed, carried on with their work as if the man were a mere shadow passing through. He made his way to the counter, where a young woman in her 20s stood behind a gleaming desk, typing on a keyboard. The man, his voice hoarse from years of experience, cleared his throat. "I'm here to withdraw some funds," he said, his voice not loud, but carrying a sense of authority that didn't match his appearance. The woman behind the counter glanced up briefly, her eyes scanning the man before quickly dropping back down to her screen. "Do you have an account with us?" she asked, her tone flat and dismissive. The man nodded, pulling a small, slightly worn leather wallet from his jacket pocket and extracting a bank card that had seen better days. He placed it gently on the counter in front of her, watching as she picked it up without much enthusiasm. "Let me check your account," she muttered, typing something into her computer. The screen flickered, and her face turned slightly pale as the system loaded. The man, despite his tattered clothing and weathered appearance, stood straight, his back aligned as if he were still in service, his posture dignified. The woman behind the counter, however, didn't look up at him again. A few long seconds passed before she glanced at him, her eyes now narrowed with suspicion. "I'm sorry, sir, but I don't believe your account qualifies for such a large withdrawal," she said with an air of cold finality. "There are restrictions in place that prevent us from processing this request." The man's brow furrowed slightly, but he didn't lose his composure. "I need the money for my daughter," he said, his voice carrying the unmistakable weight of urgency. "She's in the hospital. I need to pay the bills, the treatment. It's important." The woman seemed to hesitate for just a moment, but her demeanor quickly returned to that of indifference. She glanced at her colleague, a man in a tailored suit who stood nearby, observing the interaction. "Maybe you should try one of the other branches," the woman suggested, her tone suddenly curt. "There might be an issue with your account. I can't help you." The man's hand gripped the edge of the counter, his knuckles turning white. "I've been with this bank for years," he said, his voice low but steady. "I'm not some random person off the street." She looked at him for a moment, almost as if she was trying to decide whether or not he was telling the truth. Then, with a dismissive gesture, she turned back to her computer. "Sir, if you don't have the proper documentation, I can't assist you," she said flatly. The man, his jaw tightening, stepped back from the counter. He glanced around the bank, at the gleaming marble floors, the polished counters, the people in their designer clothes. It struck him how different the world inside this place was from the one he inhabited, the world he once served, protected, and swore an oath to. And now, here he was, being treated like an outsider, an unwanted intruder. But before he could turn to leave, the door of the bank swung open. A tall figure entered, followed by a pair of bodyguards dressed in formal suits. It was King Charles. The room seemed to pause, as if a collective breath had been held. The king, dressed in a navy blue suit, walked confidently toward the counter. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the scene with a careful, practiced gaze. He seemed to notice everything, every person, every detail, and yet his attention remained fixed on the elderly man at the counter. The banker woman, having been distracted by the king's presence, barely noticed the change in atmosphere. But the moment her eyes met the king's, a look of immediate recognition swept over her face. She straightened, her smile forced, her hands suddenly trembling. King Charles walked up to the counter, his gaze still on the man. "Is there a problem here, madam?" The king's voice was calm, yet it carried the authority that only someone of his station could command. The banker stammered, glancing between the king and the man in front of her. Well, Your Majesty, this gentleman is attempting to withdraw funds from his account, but there seems to be a discrepancy with his documents, and—" Before she could finish, the king's eyes narrowed as he took another step closer to the elderly man at the counter. His face, typically unreadable in public, softened just slightly, and a glimmer of recognition passed across his features. "Albert?" the king said, his voice filled with surprise and awe. "Is that you?" The room fell into stunned silence as every head turned toward the elderly man at the counter. The banker blinked, looking from the king to the man she had just dismissed. The man, Albert, stood motionless for a moment, his hand gripping the counter. His heart skipped a beat, and he finally raised his head slowly, his worn face breaking into a smile that was almost imperceptible. "Yes, Your Majesty, it's me," Albert replied, his voice steady now, tinged with pride. "Albert Thorpe, at your service. Retired, but always loyal." King Charles stepped forward, extending a hand, which Albert shook with an air of familiarity and respect. The two men shared a look that spoke volumes, a shared understanding that transcended the years and the uniforms worn. The bank employees watched in stunned silence, realizing the grave mistake they had made. The elderly man wasn't some homeless stranger. They had just denied service to a retired member of the royal guard, someone who had served the crown with honor, under the reign of the late Queen Elizabeth II. As King Charles turned to the banker, his expression became stern. "Do you realize who this is?" he asked, his voice laced with quiet but unmistakable fury. The banker could barely manage a response, her face flushed with embarrassment. I didn't recognize him, Your Majesty. I assumed—" King Charles raised a hand, silencing her. "You assumed wrong. This man is Albert Thorpe, a royal guard who served with distinction for over 20 years. He protected the Queen and the royal family with loyalty and bravery. And you, my dear, have treated him like a common criminal." The room was thick with tension. The other customers were now acutely aware of the blunder that had just transpired. Some exchanged uncomfortable glances, while others shifted nervously in their seats. King Charles turned back to Albert, offering an apologetic nod. "I am deeply sorry for this, Albert," he said. "It is unacceptable that a man of your caliber should be treated this way." Albert gave a small nod, his face still impassive, though a glint of gratitude could be seen in his eyes. "Thank you, Your Majesty," he replied softly. Turning back to the bank staff, King Charles's voice rose, firm and unyielding. "You will make sure this situation is rectified immediately. This man will have access to all of his accounts, and he will be treated with the respect he deserves. Is that understood?" The staff, stunned into submission, nodded vigorously. The once confident bank employee now looked small and insignificant under the weight of her mistake. "Yes, Your Majesty, understood." King Charles glanced one last time at Albert before offering him a kind, respectful smile. "We'll get everything sorted right away, Albert," he said. "Take all the time you need." As the bank staff scrambled to correct their error, King Charles turned to leave, his presence commanding the room. The atmosphere was charged, the consequences of their actions echoing in every corner of the building. For the man they had wronged, a quiet victory had been achieved, not just for him but for the many who had ever been overlooked or mistreated. And for the rest of the world watching, it was a reminder that dignity and respect should never be denied, no matter who you are or what you look like. The moral of the story lies in the value of respect, dignity, and the importance of not judging others based on their appearance or status. In the case of Albert Thorpe, the elderly man who was wrongfully treated with suspicion and disdain by the bank staff, we see the consequences of making assumptions about someone's worth based on superficial factors like clothing or demeanor. Albert's humble appearance belied his true identity. He was a retired member of the Royal Guard, a man who had served the nation with honor and dedication. Yet, despite his history and the respect he rightfully deserved, the bank employees dismissed him as an outsider, treating him with indifference until a higher authority stepped in to right the wrong. This story serves as a powerful reminder that every individual, regardless of their current circumstances, deserves to be treated with respect. It also highlights the tendency in society to judge others based on their external appearances or current status, without taking the time to understand their background, their experiences, or the contributions they have made. Albert's experience in the bank underscores how easily people can be overlooked or devalued when their true worth isn't immediately apparent, and how important it is to challenge these judgments. King Charles's intervention was a turning point, not just for Albert, but also for the bank staff and the other onlookers. His recognition of Albert's true identity and his immediate action to correct the situation demonstrated the power of empathy, understanding, and the importance of standing up for those who are wronged. The king's actions reminded everyone in that room that respect is not something that should be reserved only for those who fit a certain mold, but rather for everyone, regardless of their appearance or social standing. Furthermore, the story also teaches us about the importance of humility and service. Albert, despite his distinguished service in the royal guard, did not demand special treatment. He quietly persisted in his request, even when faced with discourtesy. His dignity remained intact, and he never lost his composure. In contrast, it was the hasty judgment of the bank staff that exposed the flaws in their approach, illustrating how quickly people can fall into the trap of dismissing others based on assumptions. The story also highlights a broader societal issue: the tendency to equate wealth, status, or outward appearances with a person's worth. The modern world is often fixated on external measures of success, whether it's material wealth, social status, or physical appearance. In this story, the elderly man's worn clothing was a signal to the bank staff that he didn't belong in their polished, high-status environment. However, King Charles, who was able to look beyond the surface, saw the true worth of the man in front of him and righted the wrongs that had been done. In essence, the moral of the story is that true value lies not in outward appearances, but in the respect and dignity every person deserves. Everyone has a history, a story, and a contribution to make, regardless of where they are in life at any given moment. The story serves as a call to practice empathy and to remind ourselves that we are all human beings deserving of kindness and respect. It's a reminder to not judge others based on their outward appearance or social standing, but to treat everyone with the dignity they deserve, just as we would hope to be treated ourselves.